Hi, my name is Shaquille Shaniqua Joy, and today I'm here with Natasha Greenhalgh to talk a little bit more about sound and spatial design, many more things as well. But I wanted to know, how would you actually introduce yourself?
Co-founder and creative director of Next Museum, and obsessed with how we can use space to unite people.
Wonderful. I'm excited to have a conversation with you about sound and spaces and the way our bodies interact with technology. I'm also very interested to learn more about what brought you to co-found a museum. So thank you so much for being here today.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
How are you feeling?
Really good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Nice.
Curious to dive into a world of sound.
Yeah, me too. I want to start actually a little bit about what sparked an interest, like how you ended up being interested in sound, but also spaces and the way they can almost create worlds. That's, I think, also the way you put it. What created that interest for you?
Yeah, I've always really noticed how different spaces have a very physical impact on me. The way that they can kind of enliven you, embolden you, but also how at times they can really suppress you and make you feel smaller. And that's something that I've always been fascinated with, and how we use spaces in different ways to tell stories or to connect with people. So I suppose that's what led me first as an interest into architecture. And no offense to architects, but when I then started to dive into the studies, for me, it felt a little bit too rigid. Mm-hmm. And I've missed the freedom to explore new ways of being. Mm-hmm. So then I went into study spatial design, which for me is very much, how can you tell different stories through spaces? As you said, how do you create different worlds with spaces? And how can the spaces that we occupy be created to bring people together, to separate people, to inspire them? And for me, that's the power and the magic of space. And the very interesting thing is there's physical space, but we're seeing also a lot of more digital online spaces, online worlds. And I would go as far, maybe a bit conceptual, but we also inhabit all these different spaces and stories in our minds.
Yeah, for sure.
So how do we start to bring these different stories and these different worlds together?
Okay, and then is this something that you also constantly think about when you enter spaces and when you, I don't know, also maybe travel to different places and you notice the energies and the space? Yeah, I keep saying spaces, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And even the journey through the different spaces. A lot in Japanese, the way they design a lot of spaces is very ritualistic. So it's not just the destination space, but how do you get to that space? So even yesterday going through the airport, you're constantly going through these different moods and modes, from going through the scanning machine and I suddenly feel very tense and uncomfortable. There's lights, there's something monitoring my face. I know it's very official. My body becomes like this and we all behave in a certain way. I go through and then I sit in a cafe, which is designed to make me relax and drink my coffee. There's music doing a certain thing.
Depending on the cafe.
Depending on the cafe. So I think that's also very interesting, how we're then flowing through these different spaces.
For sure.
And then my interaction or your interaction with me in a space. So we're really sat here now to be more comfortable. But how does that space impact the way that we then relate together?
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting that you mentioned light, but also we spoke a lot about sound, obviously, how that can impact the experience that you really have. And I want to dive into that a little bit in a minute. But first, I want to know, so you studied spatial design.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot in between, because at some point you co-founded Next, a museum. What is in between that time that you can share with me? And what made you, because I think there's not a lot of people that I know that founded their own museum. I think it's quite a unique position to be in. So what made you want to take that step, and what led you to that kind of position that you're in right now?
So I worked at a lot of different agencies, creating a lot of brand experiences at the time. And that was everything from how do you take a brand identity, vision, and mission and bring it physically into space. So what does that space start to look like, feel like, sound like? how do you then interact physically with a brand? Because prior to that, for a lot of people, a brand was a logo. I mean, it's different when you start to understand the vision and mission behind a brand. So there was, one project that I did before, and they really wanted to also focus on integrating digital and technology into the spaces. And it was a retail space, and it was multiple floors, multiple rooms, huge store. Think more of a department store. And we designed the architecture of the space, the furniture, all the fixtures and fittings, the clothes rails, everything. And there was quite a lot of digital in the space in the form of screens. This was over a decade ago now. So this was at the time quite revolutionary and exciting, but you could stand in front of the screen, and RFID, which was this tracking system, could then show you the different clothes.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So it was kind of like, I suppose at that time, a Minority Report idea of how you could start to shop. And throughout the space, you could then kind of have these more digital online moments, so bridging digital and physical worlds in retail. But we also wanted to, like, really thinking of the brand, and what was important to the brand was a lot to do with the seasons, weather. So there was different interactions that would happen, or kind of takeovers throughout the day. And one of them was, it would start in one small corner of the store, and it would start with the sound of, for example, rain, and it would be very soft, very subtle, a few drips, and then this sound, along with visuals, it would kind of be sound, and now any screen would start to move its way, almost like a weather system, through the entire store, with the sound of the rain starting to amplify, getting louder, harder. The screens were starting to then, from a tablet to a screen to a huge kind of LCD wall, would all then start to pick up the attributes of this weather development, until you got to a point where the entire store inside was raining. So the sound would be really heavy, all the screens are all activated, and then the garments at some point would then start to kind of come into the content as well. But not so much, because it was more about, again, creating the mood and kind of linking back to the vision and the kind of mission, I suppose, of that brand. So yeah, that was a way of how you can really start to pull together sound, digital, physical space to really tell a strong story, and also to kind of bring people together in the space as well. So you go from your individual shopping to really kind of having this shared collective moment with everybody else.
Beautiful. Really interesting also how it travels almost through the space, right?
Yeah. Because ultimately space is growing and shrinking a lot depending on how we are responding to it. So that, I think, is quite a natural progression for me of that kind of digital and physical world coming together, and then new media art, which is what our next museum focuses on.
That was a beautiful way of explaining where you ended up now.
Yeah. I think for me that's quite a nice, because it's more tangibly brings together the meaning of journey, the physical aspect, the digital aspect. And then, I was working for a lot of brands. I moved to the Netherlands 9 years ago. And then around 6 years ago, I met my business partner, Merel, and she already had the idea to start planning next museum. And then we got together one day, and it was just the most incredible explosion and coming together of minds. And from there, we just kind of worked away every single night, every weekend. I was taking holiday days from my employer at the time to work on Next. I won't say who that was. And the concept just grew and grew. And ultimately for us, we really wanted to have a dedicated home for new media art, because unfortunately in the Netherlands, there wasn't one at the time for many reasons. They'd closed down. And there also wasn't necessarily a dedicated space for works of this scale, but also that were focusing on today's creators and makers, because there are a lot of incredible museums for dead artists, or maybe more established artists who are already kind of have access, far in their career, already have access to these incredible spaces. But so many creators and makers, where there's not a physical platform for their creativity to be shared with the world.
That's beautiful. And then what is the core of, because I have so many questions actually. You talked about creating worlds. I'm very curious to learn a little bit more how sound plays a role in that, because I think walking through the museum, as I just went, we talked about it, there's usually when you go to a museum, there's kind of an absence of sound, which I sometimes think can also be very interesting if it's like intentionally. But I pay a lot of attention like to the sounds that are around me. And when I entered Next, like it's very, I only thought about it afterwards because it makes a lot of sense with the artwork, but there's like a dynamic that happens between the visuals and the sound, and I'm curious to learn a little bit more about the curation process and also how you create this dynamic and like what goes into that process.
So for every show, it's different, and we always work with a curator. So that's the kind of the key thing, that everything comes from one particular line of inquiry from the curator.
So you always have a different curator per show?
It depends on the shows. We happen to have worked with the same curator for 3 shows, but there are some shows, yes, it's a different curators. And sometimes we also have multiple curators on one show. We have a show called Real Time, and that's looking at a scholar and a curator working together. So how can we also start to open the parameters of who is considered worthy of curating art, especially as art becomes more and more multidisciplinary. But yeah, all the sound is very intentional, but sound is also used in different ways. So sound can sometimes be used as a way to create a certain mood in a space. Sometimes it can be more electronic and more ambient to kind of create an atmosphere. But sound can also be used as part of an interaction with an artwork, which is something we also spoke about yesterday.
Yeah.
And we also really try and intentionally use the sound to create different moods and modes throughout the space. So like I was saying before, everything is about that journey and that flow through. And we don't want that whenever you come in, you are just totally and utterly kind of overloaded with sound and visual all the time. So we also try to use sound as a way to change the peaks and troughs in the flow through the exhibition. Because the aspiration is, while we would absolutely love people to be blown away and immersed, I think there's a kind of delicate balance with immersion, that immersion doesn't mean you want to totally fry everybody.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's a balance of audio landscapes with tracks, also sound sometimes in the form of voice. So we've had poetry before in the show as well. Sometimes some of the video works also have singing or spoken word. So sound is used in many different ways. And while it's used in our exhibitions, it's also used a lot in public programming, in the likes of an Amsterdam dance event.
You told me about that. Can you share a bit more?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite things that we do. We've done 3 years in a row. The first one was in lockdown, and Amsterdam dance event is one of the biggest dance events in the world in electronic dance music. And basically the whole city turns into a rave between, well, you could say Tuesday and Sunday, but some people take longer. And every single space, so many spaces become a space for music. And we've done artist residencies for the last 2 years and something before that. But it's where we pair together sound artists and visual artists to make audio-visual showcases. And what that means, I try and kind of make it more tangible, is we have our largest space called Next Stage. It's a huge limbo, so like a photography limbo. But we're talking 25 meters wide, 9 meters high, and it wraps the floor.
That's where now is the last room of the exhibition currently,
exactly,
right?
Yeah, exactly. So we can have up to 900 people, depending if you're talking to our head of operations or us. And we pair up audio, visual, and sound artists together. Last year, we kind of went pretty big. We had 12 visual artists, and I think around 15 sound artists in total.
Wow.
And over a course of 3 months, they develop a performance piece together. So they work together online, remotely, or in the space. And then that all comes together in a showcase in Next Museum.
Oh, so it's specifically for this
Specifically
occasion.
for this occasion, for Amsterdam Dance Event. We set it up so the DJ is in the middle of this big limbo, And then the crowd, the audience can be all around the DJ. So again, it's kind of this togetherness, bringing people together. And all of that is then wrapped in the sound and the visuals. So on the big projection, Limbo is the visuals being created by the visual artist on the DJ booth.
Oh, on the spot.
On the spot. Sometimes it's live, it depends on the artist. And everybody's raving basically in the art around the DJ and the visual artist. And last year was 9 performances. And this is really looking at how can we start to create more, well, for us, a better balance between visual and sound art, especially in kind of the music and festival landscape, because also something we spoke about yesterday, maybe notice is that it's often the sound artist or the DJ is the hero.
And everyone looks at them also. I sometimes find it interesting how people don't really focus on dancing with each other, but they all look, if it's a really famous DJ, they all look at the person.
Totally. Yeah. So everyone's just like focused.
Exactly.
And everybody's just like looking, and this kind of connection is maybe a little bit more lost. So for us, what was really amazing is what we noticed is when the visual artist and the sound artist are put on the same level, then the creativity just went through the roof. And I remember the year prior, most of the development of the work was done online because we were coming in or going out of COVID, who can remember anymore. And there was a duo working together, Liza and Sam. And Sam would send her visuals over to Liza as she was developing them. And Liza, I remember at one point was like, oh my God, this is incredible to see how you visualize my sounds. Actually started to impact then the way that Liza was thinking about some of the production of some of the music, and vice versa. When Liza would then, it was a beautiful loop, and then the kind of the synergy of the way they then worked. So the way they started to create together started to also shift and change and mold. And I think that's what's really exciting, is that when you then have an opportunity for different ways of seeing, making, thinking, being able to come together more equally, it just started to go in a whole new direction.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And something that I was thinking is that the way I also experienced it is walking through the different spaces. The sound almost makes the story complete.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, in the first space that we were talking about, like there's cameras that kind of scan you, is that what I could say? And draw a picture of you like immediately.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, this is kind of like scary in a way, but also cool. And the sound really enhances that experience.
Quite ominous, the sound. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's really like, it feels like, oh, I have to be careful, and the sound really adds to that experience.
Yeah.
And then as you walk through the spaces, you mentioned to me that the in-between spaces are also intentional in the way that they help to kind of
calm
transition,
you. And transition.
Transition from one to another. So can you explain a little bit more why that is necessary?
Yeah, so we did a lot of research before we built the museum, because we really wanted it to be based on the creators' dreams and desires. We also spoke to a lot of technicians. And from these conversations, 2 key things. Number one is obviously large-scale installations that are multisensory can be quite intense. And for us, while that is something that we honor, we also want to give some space or a moment to reflect and ideally learn and understand, because there's so much craft and so much development that goes into these works. But we felt by having that in the same room as the installations, it's just too conflicting, there's too much happening. So we wanted to keep that separate. So we developed an in-between space after every main artwork. So they're much smaller spaces, again, kind of back to the response of the body. It's smaller, it feels more intimate, it then encourages you to calm, to slow. And that is then a space where you can learn more about the work, where you can kind of relax a little bit, transition into the next space, and hopefully then with that more intimate space gives you a chance to focus, to learn about the works you've seen or the works you're about to see. So that's from a kind of curatorial point of view. But from a technical point of view, they also really help us to balance the sound potential leakage or transition from one work to another.
Yeah, of course.
Because if you've got one room, especially when it's a group show, let's say it's kind of a really heavy electronic beat, and the next room is more of a classical score, then you that could be a very jarring flow for you.
Yeah.
So we use that kind of in-between space or the transitional space to kind of take you through from one type of artwork into another type of artwork.
And make it less abrupt also in a way.
Exactly, yeah. And then, on the technical side, it really helps us manage then the different types of sound levels as well.
Yeah. And something that keeps coming back is like how you explain the way we feel in the space and also how our bodies react. I want to go back to that because you already mentioned with ADE that people were like kind of almost in the artwork because it was projected. Right? And I thought that was interesting because if I would have walked in that first room where there's just like faces, that's one thing. But then you notice like, oh, this is actually me or the person next to me. And that is what made it so interesting for me is like the interactive part. And that it's very technical, it's technology, but at the same time, in a way, weirdly human because it's constantly, for me, the question that came up the whole time was like, what is my role like opposite of like this technology? Can you tell me a bit more about that? And
I'm really glad that was the kind of takeaway and the response for you. That is for us a really, really big focus is the human side of the technology and trying to make us more conscious of the technologies around us. Yes, the incredible opportunities we have with them, but also a lot of the challenges that we face. And we are living in a world that is increasingly technological every single moment. And I think for us, we want to really focus on the human side of the technology and what it means for our interaction and us as a physical human species. The works that we kind of focus on are hopefully try to start to make us more conscious. Rather than being seduced by technology purely for the sake of technology, actually start to question and to think so that we don't become passive or that these technologies or those that are creating the technologies don't start to use them even more in ways that manipulate, marginalize, and control them. And this is very much what is happening. And for us, trying to help people to be conscious of how they're using technology is really important.
Yeah, you kind of already answered something that I was going to ask about how you make sure that that you kind of find a balance between not being too positive about the because it can connect and unite in a way and like have beautiful impact on different levels, but you can, as you said, also get passive and they do marginalize certain people, like the way it's set up and like the research behind it. So how do you find that balance and make sure that you have a little bit of both when it comes to the storytelling within the museum?
A lot of research, a lot of testing, and it's also how we put the works together. So, for example, number one, I think, is to give the context and the information so people have the understanding. And it's all about how we divide them through the space. So, for example, we don't necessarily want to have a run of works that are very scientific heavy together, because that might also make people fatigue, or even worse, in my mind, they go, oh, that's not for me, and they walk on. And the aim for us is how can we also make art more approachable for a broader audience? And also with that, how can we make complex topics or scary topics more approachable and more interesting for a broader audience? Because a lot of people know there's kind of shady or scary things going on, or maybe they don't, but there is the opportunity to read and to learn and to understand, but people don't want to. So what we want to do is find a way that encourages people to want to. So by having installations or work that hopefully emotionally engage you, what the aspiration is then you might want to dive in a bit more conceptually, technically, philosophically. So I think it's having works that you can first have an emotional reaction to or emotional relationship with, and that's where interaction is quite strong, because then it's about your own personal relationship with the work. And even if it's not interactive, how I engage with a work on one day is different to another day, depending on my mood, let alone how I respond versus somebody else. So for us, that's really important to kind of set the space or the flow in a way that people can journey through it as feels comfortable to them. because if they don't feel comfortable, they're not going to want to engage. So that's the key thing. And then hopefully they can dive in deeper. And I think having a range of mediums throughout the exhibition. So, for example, not just projection walls everywhere is really important as part of that. So showing different types of mediums, different ways of engaging, of interacting. So a mix of physical works, of digital works, and also works that have different moods and modes, maybe some higher level, lower level, larger scale, smaller scale, because that also helps you keep focus and attention.
Yeah, and I also think what I was thinking about right now when you were speaking is that probably my experience, when you said like one day you engage with it differently than another day, I was also thinking that my experience was based on who I was surrounded by, because in some of the rooms I would maybe, like I was quicker to understand the artwork because I saw someone else interacting with it. So then if I would have walked through it by myself in a completely empty space, I was thinking maybe there were some things that I wouldn't have immediately understood. You know what I mean?
And I think also seeing it with loads of people in the space is also interesting, because then you start to look at group dynamics and how then that's starting to impact people as a group. And a lot of this particular exhibition at the moment, Random International, it really is looking at swarming and flocking. So how do we act as an individual versus as a collective? What makes us feel protected by a group, what makes us feel suppressed by a group, and the different ways that we then kind of move through the world together. So that is really interesting to see, and especially with technology and the work you just described, which is basically making a photograph of you live in the space, watching other people's reactions is really interesting. And there's actually a window in that space, because it's supposed to feel a bit like a surveillance space. And my favorite spot in the museum is sitting on the opposite side in that room, and I just sit there and I just watch everybody as they come in and kind of get surveilled by the camera.
What are spaces, because obviously like you do a lot of research, I can imagine, or you have to basically, but what are spaces that you go to find inspiration, or are there, or maybe it doesn't even have to be a physical space, like can be sound or anything that you intentionally seek where you know, oh, I can find inspiration there?
Well, the curators are the ones that curate the artistic side of the exhibitions. Spatially, for me, where do I go for spaces? I would actually say film and book, because I think that in stories, there's a whole new way of looking at space. And space for me comes down to the human interaction, and then you build the space out from the human interaction. So for me, I think that is the most inspirational. And when I was studying at art school, I went to museums, and the way the installations were designed was always for me what was most inspirational.
Yeah. And do you feel like you, in comparison to other people, pay more attention now everywhere you go, like especially with the museum in mind, like that you pay attention to, like, oh, the sound is like this here, and like if they would have done this and this, like it would be different for me, or I don't know. Do you ever think about that?
100%. Yeah, sometimes annoyingly.
Yeah.
But that's also why I then love going into nature, which is then where I get a lot of inspiration, because then it's like, shut off human mind, just be, nature's got this. And kind of for me, that's a very powerful way of also finding inspiration, because again, it's then totally back to the body, because in theory we have less control of then the natural surrounding. And for me, that's when then it really becomes more true.
That makes a lot of sense, especially if you, because at the end of the day, it is kind of a very clean environment and a very, not static, but like it's weird because it does feel.
It's also very chaotic.
Yeah, I just wanted to say
chaotic,
it does feel as if it is the opposite of nature, but it's at the same time the certain aspects you can like kind of relate back to it.
Because nature is just endless layers of textures, sounds, colors, materials. It is so complex. What I love with being in nature is it really makes you start to zoom in on and feel all the different details, whether it is the sound, whether it is the movement of the wind, or kind of to really notice that, because ultimately we are still human. And I think that's why we're then with building spaces, or why sound is so important, it's important to kind of create these spaces and sounds, remembering our human senses.
Yeah, and I think that's also what you mentioned when you said that you think it's interesting and important to have a physical space for something that is so what's the word? Technological?
So technological.
Thank you.
And especially, with so much digital happening.
Yeah.
And if we want to also make technology more approachable, more understandable, I really believe that having a physical space where we can come together to learn, to connect, to be inspired is really powerful and really important.
Yeah.
Especially to break away from the kind of, I always describe a lot of technology as encaged in this prison, the frame that we put around everything. I mean, digital is limitless, it's boundless, but we cage it in particular devices, understandably. But I mean, then we're sitting like this or holding it like this, or, every time I go back to London, I'm so confronted that everybody is like this on the tube.
Yeah.
So next, it's really important that we kind of make it something social and something shared. We can enjoy this art, the sound, or kind of learn together, but kind of from a point where our bodies can stand more proud, that we can move, that we can interact, and we're not just kind of sinking into this grey shell.
Yeah, and do you then also actively think about how all of our senses can be like kind of, tickled?
100%, yeah. And this is why sound for us is so important. How can the sound or the space or the visual be used to really kind of enliven or embolden the body? Or actually, we also use it to show how it can really shrink the body or make you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
There's a work at the moment where it's called the living room, and there's lights and smoke that you walk through, and there's moments where it can open up a path in front of you.
Yeah.
But there's moments where the light, and we spoke about this, almost feels like a cage in front of you. And the sound is really used again to amplify that.
Yeah.
The sound was made by Signa, and it was a whole orchestra. And she stuffed the instruments all with cork. To really try and get this kind of internal sound, so it really sounds like the breathing. And again, for her, it was this real focus of how important it was to come back to the breath, back to the body, and to kind of really bring you to those human elements.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's really interesting. Everything that you say makes so much sense now after I also experienced it. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. What are you excited about right now? This is one of my favorite questions to ask everyone, because I always think it can be anything.
What excites me the most is waking up in the morning and there's a band called Young Fathers, and there's a song called I Saw, and I put it on and I actually just dance like a total crazy person for 4 minutes solid, and it just reinvigorates me because I'm one of these weird people that processes and works in my sleep. Very bizarre. I think it's also being visual. So sometimes I wake up and I really need to shake it off. So that is something that really excites me. Work-wise, I'm really looking forward to this year's ADE because we didn't do 2023, so 2024, we're planning to come back with a big bang of performances.
I'm excited to see everything that you're going to do individually and with the museum collectively. Also excited to see more art and more exhibitions and programs and be amazed and inspired. Thank you so much for your time, for talking to me. I can imagine you're busy.
Such a pleasure.